Opening the English, white immediately contests central squares and hints at a flexible setup, prioritizing piece development over immediate pawn advances. Mirroring the flank pawn instantly builds symmetry and contests central squares for future skirmishes. Developing the knight immediately grabs central space and eyes the queenside, preparing for rapid development and potential kingside action. Challenging the center with knight development, preparing to contest the d4 square and potentially strike at white's pawns. Preparing for a fianchetto, this move aims to establish a long-term pawn structure while indirectly pressuring the center. Developing knights harmoniously, this prepares to challenge the center, potentially leading to skirmishes on the d4 square and influencing piece activity. Developing the bishop to a potent diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside while solidifying white's control of central dark squares. Black mirrors white's fianchetto, preparing to lock down the center and generate kingside pressure. Opening the center with d4 aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and aims to seize initiative by creating open lines for the pieces. Opening the central d-file immediately sparks a dynamic fight for territory, forcing rapid development and precise calculation. Recapturing the pawn with the knight firmly establishes white's central presence, immediately challenging black's knight and creating a dynamic pawn structure where neither side has a clear space advantage yet. This piece placement is crucial for future kingside development and potentially preparing e4. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies black's fianchetto structure, preparing to castle and aiming its long-range power at white's queenside. This posture offers flexibility, potentially supporting a d5 pawn push or allowing the knight on f6 to redeploy. Reinforcing the central pawn allows for increased piece mobility, a classic strategy to gain initiative in this symmetrical English opening structure. Fortifying the monarch with a timely castling, black prioritizes king safety and readies pieces for central engagement, a standard yet crucial maneuver in this Sicilian setup. Castling now secures the king, creating a robust defensive wall while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks for future action along open files. Instantly redirects queen pressure, threatening that d4 knight and preparing for potential kingside pawn advances like b5. Retreating the knight to a more secure square avoids the immediate threat from the queen, while also preparing to contest the d-file should black choose to play d6. The knight now eyes the c5 square, potentially aiming to support a future e4 push or to redeploy to the queenside if the center dynamics shift. This subtle repositioning keeps options open and maintains a flexible pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to the flank, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the open files, though this bold redeployment leaves the king slightly exposed and demands careful calculation to avoid counterplay. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust boldly claims space and prepares to challenge black's queenside initiative, hinting at a potential kingside attack once pieces are harmonized. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop the light-squared bishop, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially target the kingside. Initiating queen exchange at this juncture radically simplifies the battlefield, immediately transitioning play towards an endgame scenario and significantly diminishing the complexity of navigating a crowded center. The knight now embarks on an adventurous excursion towards white's queenside, aiming to disrupt the harmony of black's pawn structure while avoiding immediate recapture and potentially eyeing squares like c2 or b3. This maneuver sacrifices the central presence of the knight, introducing a degree of imbalance that could lead to tactical complications if white isn't vigilant in coordinating their pieces to exploit the open central files. Seeking to disrupt black's harmonious piece development and establish a dominant outpost, the knight boldly ventures to d5. This maneuver not only threatens to infiltrate black's queenside, but also aims to restrict the scope of the g7 bishop, potentially creating long-term positional weaknesses. White is willing to concede a slight pawn structure disadvantage in the center for this active knight placement, hoping to exploit any overextension or tactical oversight from black. The idea is to provoke a reaction and exploit the resulting imbalances. Securing the queenside flank, This pawn push prepares for potential pawn advances like b5, gaining space and limiting the reach of white's knights, especially the one now on b3. Securing the b-file for the rook heralds a shift towards active operations on the queen side, aiming to prevent black's knights from achieving comfortable outposts while also preparing potential pawn advances or piece transfers down this open avenue. Black's initiative on the queen side, forcing white's knight back, now seeks to exploit the newly opened space by advancing the pawn to a4, aiming to dislodge white's queenside structure and potentially create lasting weaknesses. A strategic pivot, this knight repositions to bolster the queenside and potentially reroute towards the center or kingside, aiming to exploit black's slightly overextended pawns and prepare for a more active pawn structure. Sensing an opportunity to reposition its knight for a more active role, black injects some dynamic potential into its structure. This foray aims to challenge white's central pawn advance and potentially prepare for future pawn breaks, while also keeping an eye on the king's safety. Positioning the rook on the open e-file now secures that critical central artery, aiming to challenge any potential black rook incursions and prepare for future pawn pushes, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the kingside. Releasing the central tension with the knight exchange immediately signals a shift towards a more open game, where pawn structures and piece activity will dictate the flow. By taking on d5, black aims to simplify and potentially exploit the bishop pair later, but this also opens the e-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure. Consider the long-term impact on piece mobility. Are your knights positioned to control key squares, or have you traded off your defenders too readily? This decision sets the stage for a battle of initiative, where precise maneuvering will be paramount. The pawn advances, immediately contesting the central files and preparing to expand on the queen side, potentially creating a passed pawn in the long run while challenging black's knight. The knight's hop to b4, a bold outrider, probes the queen side while eyeing the c2 square, a potential thorn in white's developing structure. Consider the implications of its placement on the flank. Confronting the advanced knight, this pawn thrust, while seemingly restrictive, aims to disrupt black's queenside ambitions and create a foothold for the white rook on the now weakened b-file. White sacrifices a touch of queenside space to gain active potential for the rook and potentially prepare for a future pawn push on the kingside, forcing black to reevaluate their attacking strategy. Exploiting the open diagonal, the knight's foray to d3 creates immediate threats against white's underdeveloped queenside pieces and the pawn on c2, forcing a potentially awkward retreat or a defensive concession. Reclaiming the open file, white endeavors to untangle their pieces and create a more coherent defensive structure, preparing to challenge black's slightly misplaced knight on d3 and prevent further inroads. Unleashing the bishop to the edge, a bold maneuver aimed at disrupting white's pawn chain and potentially creating counterplay on the kingside, although it does leave the d6 pawn somewhat exposed, and the bishop could become a target. Unleashing the f-pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's coordination, potentially carving open the kingside and challenging the bishop's influence on g7, while also preparing to assert pressure along the e-file should it ever open. The defender skillfully repositions their bishop, aiming to bolster the kingside defenses and potentially eye the d3 knight from a safer square. This subtle repositioning might also be preparing for future pawn advances on the queen side, seeking to disrupt white's control over that flank. Reclaiming the center and opening a pathway for the queen's rook to potentially contest the semi-open d-file injects a welcome dose of dynamism into white's position. Seizing the open c-file and initiating a structural advantage, black's knight decisively trades, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and open avenues for queenside pressure. Recapturing with the rook finally resolves the tension on the c-file, bringing a piece back into active service and preparing to contest control of that critical vertical. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal provides excellent attacking potential against white's slightly exposed king and creates more dynamic possibilities in the center. Unlocking potential across the central files, this bishop redeployment strategically targets the weakened kingside structure and prepares to support a future pawn thrust, aiming to gain a crucial foothold in the enemy territory. 22. RFC8 establishes vital central influence and prepares for a potential fight for the open c-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and activate the rook from its current passive position. Gnawing away at black's pawn structure, this pawn thrust seeks to disrupt the harmonious development of the enemy pieces and potentially open lines for attack. Seeking to redistribute forces and activate the bishop, black repositions the piece to d7, a quiet but purposeful maneuver aiming to support the c-file and potentially prepare for a future e5 push, while simultaneously keeping the bishop out of danger from white's aggressive g4 advance. Securing the king's new domicile, this move begins to shore up the monarch's safety, subtly acknowledging the potential for future complications along the central files as pieces are exchanged. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king's side, black aims to disrupt white's nascent attacking formation and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch, accepting a temporary pawn sacrifice to gain initiative. Sacrificing the g-pawn opens a new attacking avenue along the g-file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The bishop's relocation to the open diagonal after the capture immediately activates a piece that was previously somewhat passive, eyeing white's potentially exposed kingside and seeking to disrupt the harmony of white's pawn structure. Opening up the queenside now, you're aiming to disrupt black's coordination, potentially creating a weak pawn on c5 for them down the line while liberating your own rook to become more active. Opening up the queenside pawn structure with b6, black wisely aims to contest the queenside pawn majority white has begun to build, potentially preparing a queenside counterplay of their own. The king begins its journey towards the center, aiming to participate in the unfolding middle game struggle and prepare for a potential endgame transition. A strategic repositioning begins, aiming to challenge the open c file and activate the rook towards the queenside, potentially creating future pressure or defensive options. This pawn push aggressively claims more space on the queenside, creating potential outposts and restricting black's minor pieces, especially the knight currently on b4. Asserting control over the central dark squares, the bishop embarks on a journey to dominate the long diagonal and threaten the weakened kingside pawn structure. Launching an offensive on the queenside now, white aims to finally crack open lines for the rook and potentially create a passed pawn, forcing black to constantly defend this expanding territory. Solidifying the kingside structure, this move prevents any immediate pawn advances by white's f-pawn, creating a more robust defensive setup and anticipating potential pawn storms. The rook swings across the board, aiming to occupy the now open c-file, a critical artery for exerting pressure on black's structure and potentially challenging the misplaced bishop on d4. Relocating the monarch to a more secure square, the king actively participates in central defense, preparing to reinforce the pawn chain's integrity and survey potential threats from the advancing white rooks. Consolidating control over the central file, white endeavors to secure the d-file as a vital artery for future maneuvers, aiming to disrupt black's slightly passive piece placement and prepare for potential pawn pushes that might exploit the queenside pressure. Recentering the bishop to its more natural diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's potentially dominant queenside pawn chain and prepare for eventual activity on the kingside. Preparing to contest the crucial b-file, white aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed defensive setup and potentially initiate a queenside pawn race before black can consolidate. The rook decisively anchors itself on the 5th rank, eyeing the vulnerable a3 pawn and preventing white from establishing immediate queenside dominance. Preparing to establish dominion over the queenside by potentially activating the rook on the 4th rank, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure. A bold repositioning, the bishop seeks to tie down the rook on the b-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps create counterplay by harassing the queenside. Shifting that rook to the 2nd rank, aims to contest the open file and potentially prepare for a rook lift. Initiating a crucial maneuver, black repositions the rook to the open file, preparing to contest control and potentially infiltrate white's position on the queenside. Repositioning the rook to the second rank aims to prepare for a potential rook lift on the king side or support advances along the second rank, while also defending the d-pawn should the knight on d4 be exchanged. The bishop's retreat to g7 signals a defensive posture, repositioning itself to guard the kingside pawn chain and potentially offer support for a future pawn push on the g-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside expansion. Recapturing with the rook here, the rook transfers to an active central file, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially contest the now open d-file for influence over the center. This repositioning signals a subtle shift towards consolidating space and preparing for a more assertive presence in the latter stages of the game. Shifting the entire queen's rook to the open c-file immediately intensifies the pressure on white's c3 pawn, a key defender that's been subjected to continuous harassment. Capturing the pawn on a4 with the rook signifies a bold attempt to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and exploit the slightly exposed d4 square, potentially forcing material concessions or creating new tactical opportunities in a highly symmetrical but tense position. Initiating a recapture on the now open c-file, this audacious pawn grab aims to disrupt white's potential pressure along the queenside, forcing a reconsideration of their rook's activity and the long-term viability of their queenside majority. The rook's recapture on c4 completely redefines the material balance and the struggle for control over the open c-file. The rook now activates on an open file, threatening to infiltrate white's queenside structure and exploit the potential weakness on the c3 square. Repositioning the rook to the third rank allows it to support potential pawn advances on the kingside and potentially challenge the open c-file more effectively should black decide to commit their rooks there, while simultaneously keeping an eye on any activity on the queenside. Finally redirecting attention to the queenside, black's bishop arrives, eyeing potential breakthroughs and aiming to disrupt white's consolidated structure. Reactivating the king's bishop to a more active diagonal on the kingside opens up potential pressure against black's uncastled monarch. Activating the rook on a4 opens up the possibility of a strategic maneuver, potentially aiming to create a passed pawn or disrupt white's queenside structure by targeting the b-pawn. The pawn push on the kingside aims to pry open the h-file, potentially creating attacking chances against black's king, but it also weakens white's own king's safety by further exposing it. Seizing the initiative, black snatches the g-pawn, igniting a direct assault on white's weakened king. Reactivating the king's central presence offers a potential shift from passive defense to a more active role in the unfolding complications. The bishop sacrifices its mobility for a crucial defensive post, aiming to clog the newly opened kingside files and frustrate white's pawn advance. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal for the bishop, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. The bishop solidifies its presence on the third rank, a strategic anchor in the advancing pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's queenside play and deny easy passage to the rook. Repositioning the knight to d2 aims to untangle white's pieces and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square, perhaps c4 or even f3, to support the attack or reinforce weak points. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the fifth rank allows the rook to finally exert pressure on the open file, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. Asserting influence over the d6 outpost, the knight aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit the weak light squares. The rook's journey to b3 aims to redeploy it, potentially supporting a pawn advance on the queenside or even eyeing the f3 square if the knight vacates. This hints at a desire to activate pieces that have been somewhat static, seeking new avenues for pressure in what is becoming a complex positional battle. Snatching that pawn strategically reclaims material and immediately challenges black's potentially overextended position on the queenside. The material imbalance is stark now. Black has sacrificed the exchange for a pawn and significant positional pressure. This recapture, though logical, doesn't immediately solve black's structural issues on the queenside. The knight's redeployment to c8 injects a dynamic element into this endgame, preparing to contest the crucial light squares and potentially reinforce the queenside pawn structure. The bishop repositioning offers a flexible defender for the newly created outpost, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened kingside pawns. Activating the bishop to c7 looks like a bold attempt to disrupt black's pawn structure and create counterplay, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's active pieces. Rethinking piece deployment is paramount as the rook on b4 awkwardly hangs on the open file. Unleashing a forceful check, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the king. Shifting the king to f6, a seemingly active maneuver, instead leaves it vulnerable to the powerful diagonal pressure from the white bishop and opens potential lines of attack for white's remaining pieces. Driving the king out into the open is often a recipe for disaster, and this looks like a perfect opportunity to exploit the weakened pawn structure and the exposed black monarch. Challenging the encroaching white pawn structure and its powerful knight on c4 is paramount, forcing a reevaluation of black's piece placement and potential counterplay.